A mysterious metal box buried for decades in an abandoned shed. Ancient seeds thought to be lost forever. One struggling farmer's last chance before losing everything. This is the remarkable true story of how Mason Parker's discovery of his grandfather's final secret transformed not just his failing farm, but an entire community on the brink of collapse. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The old alarm clock rattled against the bedside table at 4:30 a.m., though Mason Parker had already been awake for 20 minutes, calculating figures that refused to add up favorably. At 35, the third-generation farmer's face carried lines beyond his years, etched there by 5 seasons of drought and the mounting debt that had followed. The family farm in Clearwater County had once been the pride of the region, 200 acres of fertile soil that had produced record corn and soybean harvests under his grandfather's care. Now nearly half lay fallow, the irrigation systems too expensive to maintain, with grain prices at a 15-year low and the reservoir levels dropping monthly. Mason glanced at the old family photos on the wall, showing the prosperous farm in earlier days. "Another 90 days, he muttered to himself. That's all the extension Heartland Bank approved. He pulled on his worn work boots and grabbed a thermos of coffee. The kitchen where Mason now sat alone had once been the heart of a thriving household. Photographs lining the walls told the story of better times. His grandfather Thomas standing proudly beside the farm's first tractor in 1962, his parents on their wedding day in front of the red barn, Mason himself as a boy, holding a county, fair blue ribbon for the Parker family's prize corn. Each memory a stark contrast to the foreclosure notice now sitting on the counter, its red, final warning stamp impossible to ignore. Mason's morning routine hadn't changed despite the farm's declining fortunes. The remaining livestock needed tending, irrigation lines required constant repair, and the small section of viable crops demanded attention. Like his father and grandfather before him, Mason believed in facing each day's work head-on, regardless of the odds. As he walked out to his truck, his old blue heeler dog followed loyally. "Come on, Blue, at least you don't care if we're going broke." As Mason drove down the dirt road, the view told the story of the farm's struggle. Once vibrant, fields now lay brown and dormant on both sides. Irrigation pipes sat dry and unused in sections where he'd been forced to abandon crops to save water for the most productive acres. Mason had inherited the farm upon his father's death 7 years ago, along with his father's principles: never take shortcuts, respect the land, and above all, never sell Parker soil to outsiders. His grandfather Thomas had purchased this land when everyone said it was too rocky to farm. His father had expanded it during the economic downturn of the 1980s, when other farmers were abandoning agriculture altogether. The Parkers had always been survivors, innovators, fighters. Mason stopped his truck to repair a section of broken fence, working with the practiced efficiency of someone who had performed these tasks thousands of times before. But this drought was different. 5 years of rainfall at less than 40% of historical averages had transformed the once lush landscape into a patchwork of dusty fields and stressed vegetation. 4 miles east, Clearwater Reservoir stood at 27% capacity, the lowest in recorded history. The once thriving agricultural community around it had begun to wither as surely as the crops. From the hill overlooking the valley, you could see the contrast. Small sections of Mason's farm remained green while large areas had turned brown. 3 neighboring farms had already been sold to Meridian Agricultural Enterprises, a corporate farming operation that was systematically buying up distressed properties throughout the county. Their massive irrigation systems, drawing from private Wells drilled deeper than any individual farmer could afford, created islands of green amid the browning landscape. Mason drove past the Henderson place, now sporting a sold sign with the Meridian Agriculture logo prominently displayed. The regional manager, Catherine Donovan, had visited Mason's kitchen 3 times in the past month, each offer more insistent than the last. "Mason, you have to recognize the reality here," she had said during her last visit, professional in her business attire as she spread documents across his kitchen table. "This isn't just a temporary downturn. Climate patterns are changing, and small operations like yours simply can't sustain the necessary adaptations. Meridian's offer is more than fair." Mason had responded firmly. "This land has been in my family for 3 generations. We don't measure its value by the acre." Catherine had looked at him sympathetically. "Your grandfather was a remarkable man, and your father too. But they didn't face what you're facing now. Sometimes honoring a legacy means knowing when to let go." Now, as Mason drove, he frowned at the memory. The latest offer lay unopened on his dashboard, 15% higher than the previous one, with an early decision bonus that would clear his outstanding debts and leave enough to make a modest new start elsewhere. The deadline for acceptance, just 10 days away. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Mason pulled up to an old storage shed at the edge of the property. The farm's outbuildings told the story of its decline. The main barn needed painting, the equipment shed housed machinery held together with spare parts and determination, and the irrigation pump house operated at half capacity. But the small structure at the northern boundary remained exactly as it had been for decades. His grandfather's workshop and storage shed, padlocked since the old man's passing 3 years ago. "Last item on the list, Grandpa?" Mason said quietly, reaching for a key on his keyring that had never been used. Thomas Parker had been an enigma to many in Clearwater County, brilliant with crops, but eccentric in his methods. While other farmers followed conventional wisdom, Thomas experimented constantly. Some of his innovations had revolutionized their operations, while others had been dismissed as the follies of an old man losing his grip. In his final years, he'd spent countless hours in this shed, refusing to discuss his projects even with family. Mason approached the shed door, hesitating before inserting the key. His grandfather's will had specified that the contents of this building were to remain undisturbed for 3 years following his death, a request that had seemed peculiar but harmless during the reading of the will. With the farm's likely sale now looming, Mason had finally run out of excuses to avoid the task. "Sorry it took so long, Grandpa," Mason sighed, looking at the padlocked door before unlocking it with the key from his pocket. The shed door protested with a rusty groan as Mason pulled it open, releasing the musty scent of trapped decades. Dust particles danced in the beams of morning light that penetrated the dark interior. The space was smaller than he remembered from childhood, maybe 15 by 20 feet, and cluttered with tools, equipment parts, and dozens of wooden crates, stacked nearly to the ceiling. "Good Lord, Grandpa, what were you keeping in here?" Mason muttered as he stepped inside, looking overwhelmed by the disorganized contents. Mason navigated carefully through the narrow pathways between stacked crates, recognizing ancient farming. Implements mixed with more modern equipment, modified in ways he didn't understand. His grandfather had always been part farmer, part inventor, part dreamer. The contents of this shed reflected all 3 aspects of the complex man who had shaped Mason's childhood. Among the disorder, one area stood out in stark contrast: a clean workbench against the back wall with a single desk lamp connected to. A small solar battery. Centered on its surface sat a large metal container, roughly the size of a toolbox, constructed of what appeared to be stainless steel with an unusual locking mechanism. Atop it lay a yellowed envelope with a single word: Written in his grandfather's distinctive script, Mason. With a mixture of curiosity and apprehension, Mason broke the seal on the envelope, unfolding pages of handwritten text that began with words that would ultimately change everything. "Mason," he read aloud, "if you're reading this, I've been gone a while, and things have likely gotten worse. What's in this box is my legacy, not just to you, but to Clearwater. When the rain stops coming, these will still grow. The instructions are inside. Your grandmother called them impossible seeds. I called them our insurance policy. Now they're your future, if you're stubborn enough to believe an old man's last project wasn't just foolishness." Mason Parker stood frozen, his grandfather's letter trembling slightly in his weathered hands. After 3 years of drought and mounting debt, after dozens of sleepless nights calculating how much of his heritage he could salvage, could salvation really be waiting in a mysterious metal box? And more importantly, after so many failed attempts to save the farm, did he have enough hope left to try one more impossible thing? The metal box sat heavy in Mason's hands as he carried it from the shed to the kitchen table. Sunlight streamed through the windows, illuminating decades of dust disturbed by his movement. The container was surprisingly weighty for its size. Roughly 18 inches long, 12 inches wide, and 8 inches deep, with an intricate locking mechanism unlike anything Mason had seen before. The rest of his grandfather's letter lay unfolded beside it, several pages of meticulous handwriting covering both sides of the yellowed paper. As Mason settled into a chair, Blue curled up at his feet, seemingly sensing the importance of the moment. "Let's see what you were up to, Grandpa," Mason murmured, continuing to read where he'd left off in the shed. "These seeds are the culmination of my life's work," the letter continued. "For 30 years, I've been cross-breeding drought-resistant varieties, experimenting with techniques most agricultural scientists dismissed as impossible. The drought cycles are getting worse, Mason. I could see it coming decades ago in the weather patterns, the soil samples, the shifting growing seasons. What's happening now isn't just bad luck. It's the beginning of a fundamental change that will transform agriculture in our lifetime." Mason paused, struck by his grandfather's foresight. Thomas Parker had been warning about changing climate patterns long before it became common knowledge, earning him ridicule from neighboring farmers who called him Doomsday Thomas behind his back. The letter continued with detailed instructions. "The box contains 12 varieties of seeds I've developed. Each is encoded with a different colored band and requires specific planting conditions, all outlined in the notebook inside. The most important is the red-banded wheat. It can survive on 60% less water than conventional varieties, while maintaining 90% of standard yield. The blue-banded corn requires 70% less irrigation, but needs particular mineral supplements. Again, all documented in my notes." Mason examined the box more closely, finding an embedded numerical keypad beneath a hinged panel. The next paragraph explained, "The combination is your grandmother's birthday, month, day, year, all 2 digits. You always were the only grandchild who remembered it without prompting." A brief smile crossed Mason's face as he keyed in the numbers. 05 to 27 to 38. There was a soft click, and the lid unsealed with a slight hiss, as if the contents had been vacuum-packed. Inside, Mason found exactly what the letter had described. Dozens of small, carefully labeled containers of seeds, each marked with colored bands. Beneath them lay a thick, leather-bound notebook filled with his grandfather's precise handwriting and detailed diagrams. "I chose you to receive this, Mason, because you have the patience this will require," the letter continued. "Your father was a good man and a fine farmer, but he never had the temperament for experimentation. You do. I've watched you since you were a boy, the way you'd spend hours observing how water moved through different soil types, how you'd question why certain fields produced better than others despite identical treatment. Mason closed his eyes briefly, remembering those childhood days at his grandfather's side. While other kids played video games or sports, he had found fascination in the complex ecosystem of the farm, the relationship between soil composition, water retention, and plant genetics. His grandfather had nurtured that curiosity, treating even his childish questions with serious consideration. I didn't share this work with anyone else because the agricultural conglomerates would have taken it and patented it, the letter explained. These seed varieties represent a potential shift in the balance of power. Drought-resistant crops that small farmers can grow without dependence on corporate irrigation systems or proprietary chemicals. Seeds that reproduce true to type, not the sterile hybrids that force farmers to repurchase every season. Mason whistled softly. If his grandfather's claims were true, the contents of this box represented exactly what the region's struggling farmers needed most: a way to survive the changing climate without surrendering their independence to corporations. Like Meridian, there's a risk in this gift, the letter warned. These seeds need to be cultivated carefully, exactly according to my notes. Rushing the process could result in failure. That's why I asked for the 3-year waiting period. By then, I calculated the drought would be severe enough that you'd be willing to take the chance, but not so desperate that you'd cut corners. The north field near the creek bed is ideal for the initial planting. The soil composition there matches what these varieties need. Mason glanced out the window toward the mentioned field, 5 acres that he'd allowed to go fallow this season due to water restrictions. The creek that once ran alongside it had been reduced to a muddy trickle, but the soil there had always been uniquely fertile, with different mineral content than the rest of the farm. One final point, the letter concluded. You aren't meant to do this alone. Contact Dr. Eleanor Chen at the University Agricultural Extension. She was my collaborator in the early stages, though she doesn't know how far I eventually took our work. Show her the notebook, she'll understand the significance. But be careful who else you trust. Not everyone will want this to succeed. The letter ended with a simple sign-off. The land endures when we honor its nature rather than force our will upon it. Your grandfather, Thomas. Mason sat back, overwhelmed by the implications. His grandfather, eccentric, stubborn old Thomas Parker, might have created exactly what Clearwater County's farmers needed to survive. Yet the rational part of his mind whispered caution. If these seeds were truly revolutionary, why hadn't his grandfather published his research? Why the secrecy, the 3-year waiting period, the elaborate security measures? Blue nudged Mason's hand with his nose, breaking the moment of reflection. Outside, the sun was climbing higher, the day's heat beginning to build. Farm chores wouldn't wait. Regardless of mysterious discoveries or potential agricultural breakthroughs, Mason carefully closed the metal container, securing it once more. The decision wasn't one he could make hastily. On one hand, the Meridian offer provided certainty, immediate debt relief, and a chance to start over elsewhere. On the other, his grandfather's seeds represented hope, but with significant risk. What if they failed? What if the old man's final project had been nothing more than the delusions of a brilliant but aging mind? As Mason moved through his morning chores, checking irrigation lines, examining the struggling crops in the south field, repairing a broken tractor belt, his thoughts kept circling back to his grandfather's letter. The detailed descriptions, the precise instructions, the references to Dr. Chen at the university, they suggested genuine science rather than fantasy. By midday, the temperature had climbed to 98 degrees, the relentless sun baking the already thirsty landscape. Mason stood at the edge of the north field his grandfather had recommended, studying the fallow ground. 5 acres, small enough to be manageable, large enough to prove the concept if the seeds performed as claimed. The water requirements his grandfather described would be sustainable even with the current restrictions. Mason's phone buzzed in his pocket. The screen displayed Catherine Donovan, Meridian. With a sigh, he answered, "Mr. Parker, I'm following. Up on our offer," Catherine's professional voice came through the speaker. "Our board has approved the enhanced terms I mentioned, but they've moved up the decision timeline. We'll need your answer by the end of the week, not next Monday as originally discussed." Mason frowned. "That's 3 days earlier than we agreed." "I understand, but several other regional acquisitions are pending, and we need to finalize our portfolio planning," Catherine explained. "I should mention that we've increased the early decision incentive by an additional 5% if you sign. By tomorrow." The pressure tactic was obvious but effective. An extra 5% would cover Mason's outstanding equipment loans, not just the mortgage. "I need the original timeline," Mason insisted. "There are some family matters I'm sorting through that affect my decision." Catherine's tone shifted subtly. "Mason, I respect your position, but I should be transparent with you. We've been in discussions with Heartland Bank about acquiring their agricultural loan portfolio in the county. If that proceeds, we'd become your primary lender, and the terms of your current extension might be re-evaluated." The implication was clear. Meridian was maneuvering to control his fate regardless of his decision about their purchase offer. "I'll have an answer for you by Friday," Mason said finally, "but not before then." After ending the call, Mason stood, motionless in the field, the weight of the decision pressing down more heavily than before. Meridian was tightening the noose, limiting his options and his timeline. If he was going to explore his grandfather's alternative, he needed to move quickly. An hour later, Mason's truck kicked up dust on the road to Clearwater State University's Agricultural Extension Office. The metal box sat secured on the passenger seat, the notebook open beside it. The more Mason had read of his grandfather's research, the more legitimate it had seemed. The genetic markers, the hybridization techniques, the detailed trials and failures, all documented with scientific precision, not the ramblings of a delusional old farmer. The extension office occupied a modest building at the edge of campus, surrounded by experimental crop plots and greenhouse structures. As Mason parked, he noticed a woman in her 60s tending to plants in one of the outdoor testing beds, her grey hair tied back in a practical ponytail, her movements efficient and purposeful despite the heat. "Dr. Chen?" Mason called as he approached, the metal box tucked under his arm. The woman straightened, shading her eyes against the sun. Her expression registered confusion, then recognition. "You must be Thomas Parker's grandson. You have his eyes." "Mason Parker," he confirmed, extending his hand. "I'm surprised you recognized me. Your grandfather showed me pictures of you many times," Dr. Chen replied, removing her gardening gloves to shake his hand. "He was immensely proud of you, though I suspect he rarely told you so directly. Thomas wasn't one for verbal affirmation." Mason smiled despite himself. "That's an understatement." Dr. Chen gestured toward the box. "I see he finally shared it with you." "You know what this is?" Mason asked, surprised. "Not specifically, no," she admitted. "Thomas and I collaborated for years on drought-resistant crop varieties, but about a decade ago he took his research private. He would occasionally mention breakthroughs, but refused to share details, said it wasn't ready, that the corporations would co-opt it before it could help the people who needed it most." She led Mason inside the building to her office, a cluttered space filled with plant specimens, research journals, and agricultural implements. Clearing a space on her desk, she invited him to open the box. "His letter said you would understand the significance," Mason explained, unlocking the container and revealing the carefully organized seed packets and the comprehensive notebook. "Doctor, Chen put on reading glasses and began examining the materials, her expression shifting from curiosity to astonishment as she turned the notebook pages. "My God," she whispered after several minutes. "He actually did it." "Did what exactly?" Mason pressed. "Created truly drought-resistant crop varieties that don't require proprietary chemicals or specialized irrigation systems," she explained, excitement building in her voice. "Do you understand what this means? These seeds could potentially thrive in conditions where conventional crops fail completely. And according to these notes, they reproduce true to type. Farmers could harvest and replant without purchasing. New seeds each season. Would they really work?" Mason asked, the critical question that had been plaguing him. Dr. Chen studied the documentation further. "The science is sound. Your grandfather was brilliant, if unconventional. These hybridization techniques, combining modern genetics with heritage varieties and wild species adaptations, it's revolutionary in approach." She looked up at Mason. "But there's only one way to know for certain." "We have to plant them," Mason concluded. "Yes," she agreed. "And soon, to take advantage of the remaining growing season." She paused, studying his face. "But I suspect there's a complication, or you would have come to me immediately after finding these." Mason nodded, explaining his financial situation, the Meridian offer and the accelerated timeline. "Ah," Dr. Chen said when he finished. "Now I understand why Thomas set up the 3-year waiting period and the security measures. He anticipated this moment, when you'd be caught between corporate pressure and his alternative solution." She closed the notebook thoughtfully. "Mason, what your grandfather created here could change everything, not just for your farm, but for small agricultural operations throughout the region. But it would be dishonest to tell you there's no risk. These seeds are experimental, and even with Thomas's meticulous notes, success isn't guaranteed." "And Meridian's offer is guaranteed," Mason added, voicing the dilemma that had been tormenting him since opening the box. "Yes," Dr. Chen acknowledged, "that's the choice you face, security or possibility, the certain end of your family's farming legacy, or a chance, just a chance, at its transformation." As Mason left the extension office an hour later, the decision before him had come into sharper focus. Dr. Chen had offered to analyze the seeds in her lab to verify their genetic markers against his grandfather's documentation. But the process would take several days, pushing up against Meridian's deadline. The choice was becoming clear: trust his grandfather's vision or surrender to the changing realities of modern agriculture. Security or possibility, certainty or hope. Mason Parker drove back toward his farm as the afternoon sun beat down on the parched landscape, the metal box once again secured on the seat beside him, its contents representing either salvation or one final disappointment in a long series of setbacks. Dawn broke over the Parker farm, with the sky already promising another scorching day. Mason had barely slept, his mind wrestling with the decision that would determine not just his future, but potentially the future of farming throughout Clearwater County. The metal box sat on his kitchen table where he'd left it the night before, its contents simultaneously offering hope and uncertainty. Blue watched from his usual spot by the door as Mason poured coffee into a thermos. The morning farm routine wouldn't wait, regardless of life-altering decisions looming over him. The livestock needed tending, and the remaining crops required checking, even as Mason's thoughts kept circling back to his grandfather's seeds. After feeding the animals and inspecting his struggling corn in the south field, Mason returned to the house and spread his grandfather's notebook across the table. The pages detailed soil preparation techniques, unlike anything taught in modern agricultural schools, methods that incorporated traditional knowledge with cutting-edge science. According to Thomas Parker's notes, the north field would need specific mineral amendments before planting. The soil composition there already contained many of the necessary elements, but would need supplementation with a mixture his grandfather had formulated, a combination of volcanic ash, pulverized oyster shells, and trace minerals that would support the drought-resistant varieties without chemical fertilizers. Mason checked his watch. It was barely 7:30 a.m., too early to call Dr. Chen for her input. Instead, he pulled out his laptop and began researching the components his grandfather had listed. Most were available locally, though a few would require special ordering. The total cost would be significant, nearly $5,000 for the 5-acre test plot. Money that would reduce his already thin financial margins even further. His calculator told the harsh truth. If the seeds failed, that investment would accelerate his financial collapse. Meridian's offer, sitting unsigned on the counter, promised immediate relief from these constant calculations and the sleepless nights they caused. Mason's phone rang, interrupting his deliberations. The screen displayed Heartland Bank. "Mr. Parker," began the familiar voice of William Travers, the bank's agricultural loan officer. "I'm calling regarding your mortgage extension." Mason tensed. "The paperwork was finalized last week. We agreed to 90 days. Yes. Well, there have been some developments," Travers said, his voice carrying the practiced sympathy of someone delivering unwelcome news. "As you may have heard, Meridian Agricultural Enterprises is in discussions to acquire our agricultural loan portfolio. Catherine Donovan mentioned something about that," Mason replied, his grip tightening on the phone. "As part of the pre-acquisition review, all extensions are being re-evaluated according to Meridian's risk assessment protocols," Travers continued. "I regret to inform you that under their criteria, your extension period is being reduced to 30 days effective immediately." Mason's free hand formed a fist. "That's not legal. We have a signed agreement. If you review Section 12B of your extension document, you'll find that the bank reserves the right to modify terms in the event of portfolio restructuring." Travers countered smoothly. "I understand this is difficult news, Mr. Parker, but I wanted to inform you personally, rather than having you receive the formal notice in the mail." "This is Meridian putting pressure on me to sell," Mason said flatly. A pause. "I can't comment on Meridian's business strategies. I'm simply conveying the bank's position as your loan officer." After ending the call, Mason stood motionless in his kitchen. The timeline for his decision suddenly compressed from months to weeks, 30 days, not enough time to prove his grandfather's seeds could succeed, even if they performed exactly as described in the notes. Mason's phone buzzed with a text message from Dr. Chen. "Lab analysis underway, initial results promising. Can you come in this afternoon?" The University Agricultural Extension Office was busier than it had been the previous day. Mason navigated around groups of students receiving instruction in one of the test plot areas, making his way to Dr. Chen's building. He found her in her lab, bent over a microscope with intense concentration. "Thanks for coming on short notice," Dr. Chen said, looking up as Mason entered. Her expression was animated with barely contained excitement. "I've been examining your grandfather's seeds since dawn, Mason. These varieties are remarkable." She led him to a computer displaying complex genetic analyses. Thomas combined traits from ancient landrace varieties with modern cultivars and several wild species to create something genuinely innovative. The drought resistance mechanisms are multi-layered: enhanced root structures, modified stomata to reduce water loss, and biochemical pathways that allow the plants to enter a dormant state during extreme conditions without dying. "So they work?" Mason asked, cutting to the heart of his concern. "In theory, absolutely," Dr. Chen confirmed. "I've never seen anything like them, but there's something else you should know." She pulled up another screen showing side-by-side comparisons of plant cell structures. "Your grandfather didn't just create drought-resistant crops. He developed varieties that actively regenerate soil health through enhanced mycorrhizal relationships. Seeing Mason's confusion, she elaborated. Plants normally form partnerships with beneficial fungi in the soil, trading sugars for minerals and water. Your grandfather's varieties form supercharged versions of these relationships that not only help the plant survive drought, but actually improve soil structure and water retention over time. He created seeds that heal the land, Mason said quietly, remembering his grandfather's final words in the letter. The land endures when we honor its nature rather than force our will upon it. Exactly, Dr. Chen nodded. Planted strategically over several seasons, these crops could potentially reverse some of the damage done by decades of industrial agriculture and climate change. She led Mason to a small greenhouse attached to the laboratory, where she had already planted samples of the seeds in controlled environments. I started these this morning. The germination rate is extraordinary, nearly 100%. That's unprecedented for experimental varieties. As Mason examined the already sprouting seedlings, Dr. Chen continued, I've also begun composition analysis of the soil amendment formula in Thomas's notes. The combination is ingenious. It provides essential minerals while creating the perfect environment for the enhanced mycorrhizal relationships. The formula could be produced locally with minimal investment. Speaking of investment, Mason said, I had some unwelcome news this morning. He explained the bank's sudden reduction of his extension period. Dr. Chen's enthusiasm dimmed. 30 days isn't enough time to fully prove these varieties in field conditions. No, Mason agreed, which means I have a decision to make, and quickly. Trust my grandfather's research and risk everything, or take Meridian's offer and walk away. Dr. Chen was silent for a moment. There might be a third option, she said finally. What if we could get support from the university for a rapid trial? I have some discretionary research funds, and these seeds align perfectly with our department's focus on sustainable agriculture. Hope flickered in Mason. What would that look like? We could establish a joint research project. The university provide some funding and scientific oversight, while you contribute the land and your grandfather's research. We could prepare and plant the North Field within a week. Would that be enough time to show results before the bank's deadline? Mason asked. Dr. Chen hesitated. For conclusive results, no. But if the varieties perform even half as well as Thomas predicted, we should see preliminary evidence within 3 weeks, enough to apply for emergency extension on your loan based on research significance. As they discussed details, Dr. Chen's department chair, Dr. Wilson, stopped by the lab. After brief introductions, Dr. Chen explained the potential breakthrough represented by Thomas Parker's seed varieties. Wilson's initial skepticism visibly shifted as Dr. Chen showed him the preliminary analyses. This could qualify for our rapid agricultural innovation grant, he mused. Especially with the drought emergency declaration for the county last month, we could fast-track the approval process. For the first time in months, Mason felt genuine hope rising. With the university's support, his grandfather's seeds might have the chance they deserved. But as the conversation continued, a new complexity emerged. There's the question of intellectual property, Dr. Wilson noted. If these varieties perform as indicated, they represent significant commercial value. The university would require certain rights as part of any research partnership. Mason stiffened. My grandfather specifically wanted these seeds to help independent farmers, not become corporate property. I understand that sentiment, Wilson replied, but research requires funding. Perhaps we could structure an agreement that protects farmers' access while allowing the university to license the technology to cover research costs. The discussion continued for another hour, outlining a potential partnership that would provide Mason with immediate financial support while giving the university research access to Thomas Parker's innovations. The draft agreement they developed would preserve farmers' rights to use and reproduce the seeds while allowing commercial licensing to large agricultural operations at premium rates. By late afternoon, Mason was driving back to his farm with a tentative timeline. University agronomists would visit tomorrow to collect soil samples from the North Field. Dr. Chen would complete her analysis of the soil amendment formula by the weekend. And if all proceeded as planned, planting could begin early next week. As his truck bounced down the dusty road toward home, Mason noticed a black SUV parked in his driveway. Catherine Donovan stood beside it, checking her watch impatiently. Mason's momentary optimism faltered. Meridian wasn't giving up easily. "I've been trying to reach you all day," Catherine said as Mason parked and stepped out. "Our board has authorized me to increase our offer by another 10%, but only if you sign today." Mason studied her carefully. "That's quite a sudden increase. Something must have changed." Catherine maintained her professional composure, but Mason detected underlying tension. "Market conditions fluctuate. This is simply the current valuation. Or Meridian learned something that makes my property more valuable than you initially thought," Mason countered. "Perhaps something about innovative, drought-resistant crop varieties." A flicker of surprise crossed Catherine's face before she controlled it. "I don't know what you're referring to, Mr. Parker. Our offer reflects standard agricultural land valuation for the region, adjusted for water rights and potential productivity." But Mason had seen enough. Somehow, through the bank, through university connections, or through other channels, Meridian had learned about his grandfather's seeds. Their sudden urgency and escalating offers weren't about adding his modest farm to their portfolio. They wanted to acquire and control Thomas Parker's innovations. "I'll need more time to consider your offer," Mason said evenly. "Time isn't on your side, Mason," Catherine replied, her tone hardening slightly. "Heartland Bank has made their position clear. 30 days isn't much runway for a farm in your financial condition." "Nevertheless, I'm not making this decision today," Mason stated firmly. As Catherine drove away, Mason pulled out his phone and called Dr. Chen. "Meridian knows," he said without preamble. "They just increased their offer significantly, pushing for an immediate decision." "I was afraid of this," Dr. Chen sighed. "Agricultural innovation is a small world, and Meridian has research partnerships with several universities. We need to move quickly." "How quickly can we get the North Field prepared?" Mason asked. "If we can secure the mineral amendments tomorrow, we could begin soil preparation immediately," Dr. Chen replied. "I'll bring students to help. We could be ready to plant by the weekend." Mason looked out over his struggling farm at the parched fields that had been in his family for generations. His grandfather had foreseen this moment, the pressure from corporate interests, the accelerated timeline, the difficult choice between security and possibility. "Let's do it," Mason decided. "First thing tomorrow." That evening, as the sun set, over Clearwater County, Mason sat on his porch, his grandfather's notebook open on his lap, blue resting at his feet. The metal box with its precious seeds sat beside him, its contents representing both his greatest risk and his greatest hope. The path ahead was far from certain. Meridian and the bank would continue applying pressure. The seeds, despite their promising initial tests, remained unproven in field conditions. The 30-day deadline loomed like a storm on the horizon. But for the first time since the drought had begun to strangle his livelihood, Mason Parker felt the stirring of something long dormant within him. The same stubborn determination that had led his grandfather to spend decades developing seeds that could survive when all else failed. The determination that had defined generations of Parkers who had coaxed life from this land when others said it couldn't be done. As darkness settled over the farm, Mason continued reading his grandfather's meticulous notes, preparing for the battle that lay ahead, not just for his family's legacy, but potentially for the future of farming in a changing world. The North Field bustled with more activity than it had seen in years. A team of graduate students from the University Agricultural Department worked alongside Mason, carefully incorporating the mineral amendment mixture into the soil. Dr. Chen supervised the process, clipboard in hand, frequently consulting Thomas Parker's notebook to ensure precise adherence to his specifications. "The pH levels are exactly where your grandfather predicted they would need to be," Dr. Chen remarked, reviewing soil test results. He understood this land at a level most scientists never achieve. Mason nodded, running soil through his fingers. The texture was already changing, becoming darker and more granular as the amendment mixture integrated with the native earth. His grandfather's formula included components that would typically take months to break down and become bioavailable to plants, but Thomas had developed an enzymatic catalyst that accelerated the process to mere days. "Will it really be ready for planting by tomorrow?" Mason asked, still finding it hard to believe soil conditions could change so rapidly. "According to these readings, yes," Dr. Chen confirmed. "The microbial activity is already increasing exponentially. Your grandfather's methods compress what would normally be seasonal transitions into a matter of days." As they worked, a small drone appeared overhead, hovering just beyond the property line. Mason shaded his eyes, looking up at the device. "Meridian," Dr. Chen said quietly. "They're monitoring our activity." "Is that even legal?" one of the graduate students asked. "As long as it stays in public airspace," Dr. Chen replied. "Corporate espionage has become standard practice in agricultural innovation. It's why we filed the provisional patent application this morning." The patent had been a compromise between Mason's desire to honor his grandfather's wish for freely available seeds and the university's need to protect the research. The agreement they'd structured would allow small farmers to use and propagate the seeds at minimal cost, while charging commercial operations market rates, with proceeds supporting further research and a foundation to help independent farmers adapt to changing climate conditions. By mid-afternoon, the soil preparation was complete. The amendment mixture had been incorporated throughout the 5-acre field, irrigation lines had been checked and optimized for minimal water usage, and sensor equipment had been installed to monitor soil, moisture, temperature, and microbial activity. "Now we wait until morning," Dr. Chen explained. "The enzymatic processes need 12 hours to fully catalyze. We'll plant at dawn tomorrow." As the university team packed up their equipment, Mason noticed a familiar black SUV pulling up his driveway. Catherine Donovan emerged, dressed more casually than in previous visits, but still projecting corporate efficiency. "Quite an operation you've got going here," she called as she approached the field. "The university doesn't usually provide this level of support for private farms." Mason wiped his hands on his jeans. "Dr. Chen is an old friend of my grandfather's. She's interested in his agricultural methods." Catherine's smile didn't reach her eyes. "Mason, we both know what's happening here. Thomas Parker's drought-resistant seed varieties are being planted on your North Field in partnership with Clearwater State University." She gestured toward the drone, now returning to her vehicle. "Did you think Meridian wouldn't notice?" Dr. Chen stepped forward. "Ms. Donovan, I presume. I'm Dr. Eleanor Chen, Chair of Sustainable Agriculture at CSU. The research project underway here is protected by university protocols and a provisional patent filing." "Of course," Catherine nodded. "Which is why I'm here with a new proposal." She handed Mason a folder. Meridian is prepared to triple our original offer for your farm with an additional licensing agreement for the seed technology developed by your grandfather. Mason stared at the figure on the document. Enough money to not only clear his debts, but to live comfortably for years, possibly decades. The licensing agreement included royalties that would generate ongoing income tied to Meridian's implementation of the seed technology. We're also prepared to establish the Thomas Parker Innovation Center, Catherine continued, a research facility named after your grandfather that would continue developing his work, with you as a consulting director. Dr. Chen's expression remained neutral, but Mason could see concern in her eyes. This offer was exponentially more attractive than anything previously discussed, and potentially more beneficial to Thomas Parker's legacy than the modest university partnership. I'll need to review this thoroughly, Mason said carefully. Of course, Catherine agreed, but I should mention that our board meets tomorrow afternoon to finalize several regional acquisitions. This offer would need to be accepted by noon to be included in the current funding cycle. After Catherine departed, Dr. Chen didn't mince words. They're trying to control the technology, Mason. Once Meridian owns these seeds, they'll patent every aspect, restrict propagation rights, and create proprietary systems that keep farmers dependent on their products. But they'd be preserving my grandfather's name, Mason countered, still processing the offer. His work would reach farms across the country, maybe globally. At what cost? Dr. Chen challenged. Your grandfather spent decades developing seeds that could free farmers from corporate dependence. Do you really think he'd want his name on a research center developing ways to maintain corporate control over agriculture? Mason had no immediate answer. The Meridian offer solved his financial problems completely while honoring his grandfather's innovation. The university partnership preserved the spirit of his grandfather's intentions, but provided less financial security and smaller-scale implementation. That evening, Mason sat alone on his porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant oranges and purples. Blue lay at his feet, occasionally sighing as if sensing his master's internal conflict. The metal box that had contained the seeds sat empty on the porch railing, its purpose now fulfilled. Mason's phone rang, the display showing an unfamiliar local number. "Is this Mason Parker?" asked an older man's voice when he answered. "Yes, speaking. Frank Henderson here. I sold my place to Meridian last year. Been meaning to stop by, but—" The voice trailed off momentarily. "Anyway, just saw their fancy SUV leaving your place again, and figured they're putting the squeeze on you too." Mason remembered the Henderson farm, 300 acres bordering Clearwater River, now bearing the Meridian corporate signage. "They've made an offer," he acknowledged. "Thought so," Henderson replied. "Look, I don't know your situation, but there's something you should know about Meridian before you sign anything. They didn't honor half the promises they made to me. That continued consulting role they offered lasted 3 months before they brought in their corporate team. The preservation of historical structures they guaranteed. They bulldozed my grandfather's barn 2 weeks after closing." Mason listened as Henderson detailed other broken promises, from employment opportunities for local workers to community access to traditional fishing spots along the river that had been open to neighbors for generations. "Why are you telling me this?" Mason asked when Henderson finally paused. "Because I made a mistake selling to them," the older man said simply. "Took their money and watched them destroy a century of my family's work. If you've got any other option, take it." After ending the call, Mason returned to the Meridian contract, reading the fine print more carefully. The consulting director position at the proposed Thomas Parker Innovation Center was guaranteed for only 1 year, after which it would be re-evaluated based on project needs. The licensing agreement granted Meridian exclusive rights to all derivatives and applications of his grandfather's seed technology. His phone buzzed with a text message from Dr. Chen. Final soil readings perfect. Meeting you at 6 a.m. to begin planting. Everything ready on your end? Mason hadn't yet told her about the Meridian offer. The university partnership represented risk, both financial and agricultural. There was no guarantee the seeds would perform as well in field conditions as they had in laboratory tests. The bank's 30-day deadline remained unchanged, regardless of research potential. As darkness settled over the farm, Mason spread the two contracts side by side on his kitchen table. Meridian's offer represented certainty and security. The university partnership represented hope and his grandfather's principles. Security versus possibility. Personal comfort versus community benefit. Mason rubbed his tired eyes, the weight of the decision pressing down on him. His grandfather's journal lay open nearby, and Mason's gaze fell on a passage he hadn't noticed before, a personal reflection rather than scientific notation. The true value of innovation isn't measured in dollars or academic recognition, but in liberation. Does it free people or further enslave them? Does it heal the land or merely extract from it more efficiently? These are the questions I ask of every seed I develop. The words resonated with something deep within Mason. His grandfather hadn't spent decades in secret research simply to create a valuable commodity. He had been working toward a vision of agriculture where farmers could maintain independence, where the land could heal from the damage of industrial practices, where communities could thrive without corporate control. Mason closed the Meridian contract and reached for his phone. "Dr. Chen, it's Mason. We're on for tomorrow morning. I've made my decision." Dawn arrived with a golden clarity that seemed symbolic of Mason's resolved uncertainty. The north field lay prepared, the soil dark and rich with promise after the amendment process. Dr. Chen arrived with her team of graduate students and several faculty members who had joined the project after seeing the preliminary data. "I heard Meridian made you quite an offer," Dr. Chen said, as they unloaded trays of carefully sorted seed packets from her vehicle. "News travels fast," Mason observed. "Agricultural research is a small community," she replied. "Did you give it serious consideration?" Mason nodded. "Very serious. It would have solved all my financial problems." Dr. Chen studied him for a moment. "Yet here we are at dawn, preparing to plant experimental seeds with no guaranteed outcome. My grandfather didn't develop these seeds to create another corporate product," Mason explained. "He created them to free farmers from dependence on companies like Meridian. I couldn't take his life's work and hand it to the very system he was trying to disrupt." Dr. Chen smiled. "Thomas would be proud of that decision. Now let's see if his seeds live up to their promise." The planting process was methodical and precise. Each variety was assigned to specific sections of the field according to Thomas Parker's detailed plans. The red-banded wheat in the western section, the blue-banded corn in the center, drought-resistant beans along the eastern edge. The seeds were placed at exact depths and spacing, with minimal water applied according to the specialized guidelines. By noon, the entire field had been planted. To casual observation, it looked like any newly seeded plot, rows of freshly turned earth with no visible signs of the potential revolution germinating beneath the surface. "According to your grandfather's notes, we should see emergence within 72 hours, Dr. Chen said as they finished. "That's extraordinarily fast compared to conventional varieties. And if they don't emerge," Mason asked, giving voice to the doubt that still lingered, "then we'll know Thomas was human after all," Dr. Chen replied. "But I don't think that's going to happen. I've been studying agriculture for 40 years, and I've never seen seed science as advanced as what's documented in that notebook." As the university team departed, promising to return in 3 days to document initial emergence, Mason's phone rang. Catherine Donovan's name appeared on the display. "Mr. Parker, I'm calling to confirm you've had time to review our offer," she began when Mason answered. "Our board meets in 2 hours." "I have reviewed it," Mason confirmed, "and I've decided to decline." A moment of silence followed. "I see," Catherine finally responded, her professional tone masking whatever disappointment or frustration she might be feeling. "May I ask what led to this decision?" "My grandfather developed these seeds to help independent farmers survive changing climate conditions without corporate dependence," Mason explained. "Selling them to Meridian would betray everything he worked for." "That's admirably principled," Catherine acknowledged. "But principles don't pay mortgages, Mason. Heartland Bank's position remains unchanged. 30 days isn't much time to prove experimental crop varieties." "I'm aware of the risk," Mason replied. "In that case, I should inform you that Meridian will be proceeding with the acquisition of Heartland's agricultural loan portfolio as planned. When your extension expires, we'll reevaluate the situation." Her tone remained professional but carried an unmistakable warning. After ending the call, Mason walked slowly through his farm, past the struggling conventional crops in the south fields, past the equipment barn that needed repairs he couldn't afford, past the small family cemetery where his parents and grandparents rested beneath shade trees planted generations ago. He finally stopped at the edge of the north field, freshly planted with his grandfather's impossible seeds. Nothing was visible yet, just 5 acres of carefully prepared soil, hiding what might be either the fulfillment of Thomas Parker's visionary work or the final disappointment in Mason's struggle to save the family farm. The rational part of Mason's mind whispered that he had made a foolish choice. Meridian's offer would have secured his future and honored his grandfather's innovation, even if in a corporate context. Instead, he had bet everything on seeds that had never been field-tested, on methods that defied conventional agricultural wisdom, on a partnership that provided scientific validation but limited financial security. Yet as Mason stood at the field's edge with Blue faithfully at his side, he felt a sense of rightness that transcended practical considerations. For better or worse, he had honored not just the letter, but the spirit of his grandfather's work, the belief that agriculture could follow a different path than the corporate model of extraction and dependency. Whether that decision would save or doom the Parker farm remained to be seen. For now, all Mason could do was wait for the seeds to speak for themselves. The waiting was the hardest part. For 3 days, Mason found himself drawn repeatedly to the north field, sometimes standing motionless at its edge for long minutes, as if his watchfulness might somehow speed the germination process. Each time there was nothing to see but the same rows of prepared soil, showing no visible signs of the potential revolution happening beneath the surface. Dr. Chen called twice daily for updates on soil temperature, moisture levels, and weather conditions, which Mason dutifully recorded in a logbook modeled after his grandfather's meticulous documentation. According to Thomas Parker's notebook, the first emergence should occur exactly 72 hours after planting, a claim that seemed increasingly improbable as the third day dawned with no visible sprouts. "Maybe we did something wrong," Mason suggested during Dr. Chen's morning call. "Missed a step in the preparation, or the seeds degraded after all these years." "Your grandfather accounted for seed longevity," Dr. Chen reminded him. "The vacuum-sealed containers and temperature-stable storage methods he used are scientifically sound. Give it time, Mason." But time was the one thing in increasingly short supply. 27 days remained until the bank's deadline. Every hour that passed without visible results deepened Mason's doubt about his decision to reject Meridian's offer. He'd gambled everything on seeds that remained stubbornly dormant beneath the soil. "Come on, Grandpa," Mason muttered as he checked the soil moisture meters late that afternoon. "You promised these would work." As the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, casting long shadows across the farm, Mason completed his evening chores with mechanical efficiency. The conventional crops in the south fields continued their slow decline, stressed by water restrictions and relentless heat. The daily contrast between their struggle and the barren north field served as a constant reminder of the risk he'd taken. After dinner, a simple meal eaten alone at the kitchen table, Mason sat on the porch with his grandfather's notebook, rereading the germination instructions for any detail he might have missed. Blue lay at his feet, occasionally raising his head when Mason sighed in frustration. "I don't know what else to do, boy," Mason told the dog as darkness settled over the farm. Maybe this was all just an old man's fantasy after all. Sleep came. Fitfully that night, Mason's dreams filled with withered crops and foreclosure notices. He woke before dawn, drawn outside by some restless impulse as the first faint light appeared in the eastern sky. Coffee in hand, he walked toward the north field, more from habit than expectation. The early morning mist hung low over the ground, diffusing the growing daylight. As Mason approached the field's edge, he initially saw nothing different, just the same rows of prepared soil he'd been staring at for 3 days. Then, as he moved closer, he noticed something unusual about the texture of the ground. The surface appeared slightly disturbed in places, tiny mounds of soil pushed upward in perfectly straight lines. Mason knelt at the edge of the field, setting his coffee aside as he leaned forward for a closer inspection. The first rays of sunrise broke over the horizon at that moment, illuminating the soil at a low angle that revealed what he'd been waiting for. Thousands of tiny green shoots had emerged overnight, pushing up through the soil with such uniformity. It appeared orchestrated. Not just a few test sprouts, but a complete emergence across all planted sections. Row after row of seedlings stood barely a quarter-inch tall, their first leaves just beginning to unfurl. Mason's hand trembled slightly as he reached out to touch one of the delicate sprouts, solid, real, undeniable proof that his grandfather's impossible seeds were viable. He pulled out his phone and quickly snapped several photos, then called. "Dr. Chen, despite the early hour, they've emerged," he said without preamble when she answered. "All of them, overnight, just like Grandpa predicted. Exactly 72 hours. "I'm on my way," Dr. Chen replied, the excitement evident in her voice. "Don't do anything until we get there to document this." Within 2 hours, the field was once again a hub of activity. Dr. Chen arrived with an expanded team that included not just her graduate students, but several faculty colleagues from related departments: plant genetics, soil science, and climate adaptation. They moved methodically through the field, taking measurements, soil samples, and hundreds of photographs. "The root development is extraordinary," declared Dr. Wilson, the department chair, examining a carefully extracted seedling. "Look at the branching pattern and fine root hairs. This 3-day-old plant has root architecture we'd expect after 2 weeks of growth. And the chlorophyll concentration is off the charts," added another professor, examining leaf tissue samples. "Under a portable microscope, these plants are photosynthesizing at rates we typically only see in mature specimens under ideal conditions." Dr. Chen stood beside Mason at the field's edge, watching the scientific validation of Thomas Parker's work unfold before them. "Your grandfather was at least a decade ahead of current agricultural science," she said quietly. "Maybe more." The drone appeared overhead again around midday, Meridian's electronic spy returning to monitor their progress. This time, Mason didn't mind its presence. Let them see what his grandfather had created. Let them understand what they had failed to acquire. As the day progressed, the seedlings visibly grew, not the imperceptible growth typical of newly emerged plants, but rapid, observable elongation that the researchers measured hourly. By sunset, what had been quarter-inch sprouts in the morning stood nearly 2 inches tall, with fully developed first true leaves already expanding. At this rate of development, we should have preliminary yield data within 3 weeks, Dr. Chen told Mason as the research team packed up their equipment. Still cutting it close with the bank's deadline, but if these varieties perform according to your grandfather's projections, we'll have compelling evidence to request an extension. The good news came with a less welcome development. Word about the unusual research project had begun to spread beyond the university. A local agricultural reporter had contacted Dr. Chen for information, and 2 neighboring farmers had driven by slowing their trucks to observe the activity in the north field. We need to be prepared for increased attention, Dr. Chen warned. Innovation like this doesn't stay secret for long, especially with Meridian already aware. That warning proved prescient. The following morning, Mason found 2 unfamiliar vehicles parked at his gate, a news van from the regional television station and a pickup truck bearing the logo of a neighboring farm. As he approached, a reporter and cameraman emerged from the van while an older farmer climbed out of the truck. "Mr. Parker?" "Jim Reynolds from Channel 8 News," the reporter introduced himself. "We're doing a story on experimental drought-resistant crops being developed in the county. Dr. Chen at the university suggested we speak with you." Before Mason could respond, the farmer stepped forward. "And I'm Howard Blackwell from over in Carson County. Heard rumors about some kind of miracle seeds that can grow with practically no water. Came to see if there's any truth to it." Mason hesitated, unsure how much to reveal. His grandfather's notes had emphasized discretion, but the university partnership had already created public awareness. After a moment's consideration, he decided transparency within limits was the best approach. "I'm testing some drought-resistant varieties developed by my grandfather," Mason acknowledged. "They're showing promise, but it's early in the trial phase." "Mind if we take a look?" Blackwell asked. "My farm's been hit hard by the water restrictions. Lost half my corn already, with the rest not far behind." Mason recognized the desperation in the older man's voice, the same desperation that had driven his own decision to trust his grandfather's seeds. After a brief internal debate, he nodded. "I can show you the test field, but this is still experimental research in partnership with the university. Nothing's proven yet." The north field had transformed again overnight. The seedlings now stood nearly 6 inches tall, their leaves expanded and vibrant despite receiving only minimal irrigation, less than a third of what conventional varieties would require. The acorn section showed particularly dramatic development, with sturdy stalks already forming. "Good Lord," Blackwell whispered as he saw the field. "Those can't be just 4 days old." The reporter was equally impressed, his cameraman capturing footage of the rapidly developing crops. "Dr. Chen mentioned these were developed locally? By your grandfather?" Mason nodded, explaining Thomas Parker's decades-long research while carefully omitting specific details about the seed technology. He emphasized the partnership with the university and the potential benefits for independent farmers facing climate challenges. As the impromptu tour concluded, Blackwell pulled Mason aside. "Listen, Parker, I've got 300 acres drying up as we speak. If there's any chance I could try these seeds on a test plot of my own." "It's not that simple," Mason explained. "The seeds require special soil preparation and specific planting conditions, and they're still experimental. We don't have production quantities available." "I understand that," Blackwell insisted, "but I'm looking at losing my farm after 4 generations. I'd try anything at this point." Mason recognized his own recent desperation mirrored in the older farmer's expression. "Let me discuss it with Dr. Chen. We might be able to establish a small secondary test plot once we have more data from this field." The news story aired that evening, a 3-minute segment highlighting the breakthrough drought-resistant crops being developed through a partnership between a local farmer and the state university. The report included footage of the rapidly growing plants contrasted with struggling conventional crops nearby, along with brief interviews with Mason and Dr. Chen. By the following morning, Mason's phone was ringing constantly. Farmers from 3 counties called seeking information about the miracle seeds featured in the news report. The University Extension Office reported similar inquiries. Dr. Chen called to report that her department had received calls from 2 major agricultural publications requesting interviews. "It's happening faster than I anticipated," she told Mason. "We need to be strategic about how we handle this attention." The plants continued their extraordinary development. After just 1 week, the wheat stood 18 inches tall, the corn nearly 3 feet, and the beans had begun flowering, growth rates that defied conventional agricultural timelines. More significantly, they thrived on minimal water, while neighboring conventional crops struggled despite greater irrigation. Meridian's response came in the form of a formal cease and desist letter delivered to both Mason and the university, claiming potential patent infringement on drought-resistant crop technology the company had under development. The legal language was complex, but the message was clear. Meridian was attempting to obstruct or delay the research until after the bank's deadline. "Pure intimidation tactics," Dr. Chen declared when Mason forwarded her the letter. "They have no legitimate claim to your grandfather's work. Our legal department is preparing a response." The university's lawyer explained that while the letter had no substantial legal merit, it represented the beginning of what could become protracted litigation, a common strategy used by large corporations to exhaust the resources of smaller competitors. "We'll handle the legal response," Dr. Wilson assured Mason, "but you should be prepared for more pressure as this research gains attention." That pressure materialized the next day when William Travers from Heartland Bank arrived, unannounced at the farm. The loan officer stood at the edge of the north field, visibly startled by the rapidly maturing crops that had been bare soil just over a week earlier. "Impressive development," Travers commented, his professional demeanor not quite concealing his astonishment. "Though I'm told experimental crops don't always translate to commercial viability." "These will," Mason replied with newfound confidence. "Initial data already confirms they require 60% less water while maintaining 90% of standard yield." Travers nodded thoughtfully. "The bank has received inquiries from several parties regarding your loan situation, Mr. Parker, including a petition from the university requesting an extension of your deadline based on research." "Significance. And," Mason prompted when Travers paused. "And the bank's position remains unchanged," the loan officer stated. "While this research appears promising, our pending agreement with Meridian prohibits any modification of existing terms. Your 30-day deadline stands." As Travers departed, Mason felt a familiar wave of frustration. Despite the undeniable success of the plants growing before him, the financial vice continued to tighten. 21 days remained until foreclosure, likely not enough time to fully demonstrate the commercial potential of his grandfather's seeds. Later that afternoon, Mason was checking irrigation lines when he noticed several vehicles approaching. Along the main road, pickup trucks and farm equipment moving slowly in a loose convoy. As they neared his property, he recognized Howard Blackwell's truck in the lead, followed by at least a dozen other farmers from surrounding counties. Blackwell stepped out as the impromptu gathering formed near Mason's gate. "Parker," he called, "we've been talking. All of us who are facing the same water restrictions and bank pressures, we saw what's growing in your north field, and we want to help." Mason Parker stood in disbelief as more than 20 farmers gathered at his gate. Men and women whose families had worked the land for generations now faced the same crisis he did: a historic drought, combined with corporate pressure threatening to end their way of life. Howard Blackwell stepped forward as their unofficial spokesperson. "We've seen what's growing in your field, Parker," Blackwell said, gesturing toward the north section where the impossible seeds were thriving. "And we've heard about Meridian and the bank trying to shut you down before harvest." "Word travels fast," Mason observed. "Small communities always do." Blackwell nodded. "Most of us have gotten similar offers from Meridian. Some have already sold. But after seeing that news report, seeing what your grandfather created, we started talking. If those seeds work the way they appear to, they could save every independent farm in 3 counties. Another farmer stepped forward, a woman in her 50s whom Mason recognized as Sarah Lawson from the Eastern Valley. "My father refused Meridian's buyout offer last month," she explained. "They responded by purchasing the water rights upstream from our property. My irrigation allocation was cut by 70% overnight. They're not just buying farms, they're systematically eliminating those who refuse to sell." "That's why we're here," Blackwell continued, "to offer help, whatever you need to prove these crops before your deadline. Labor, equipment, expertise, we're all in." Mason was momentarily speechless. After months of fighting his battles alone, the sudden appearance of allies was overwhelming. "I appreciate the offer," he finally managed, "but this is experimental research. We don't have enough seeds for widespread planting, and the soil preparation is complex." "Then teach us," Blackwell insisted. "Your grandfather developed these seeds to help farmers like us survive, didn't he? That's going to take more than one test plot on one farm." Before Mason could respond, Dr. Chen's car appeared, bouncing down the dusty road toward his property. She emerged looking concerned, a folder clutched in her hand. "Mason, we have a situation," she began, then paused, noticing the gathering of farmers. "What's happening here?" "Reinforcements," Blackwell answered, before Mason could explain. "We're here to help fight Meridian and save these seeds." Dr. Chen's expression shifted from concern to contemplation. "That's actually perfect timing." She turned to Mason. "The university just received a court filing from Meridian seeking an injunction to halt our research, claiming proprietary technology infringement. It's completely without merit legally, but it will tie us up in proceedings until after your bank deadline." The news hit Mason like a physical blow. "They can't just shut down scientific research. They can delay it," Dr. Chen corrected. "Their legal department has filed motions that will require responses and hearings. The earliest court date is 3 days after your deadline with the bank." "Convenient timing," Blackwell remarked dryly. "Very," Dr. Chen agreed. "There's more. They've also filed a motion claiming any seeds harvested from the test plot are disputed property and cannot be replanted until ownership is legally determined, a process that could take years. The implications were clear. Even if Mason's test crop proved successful before the bank's deadline, Meridian was maneuvering to prevent the seeds from being shared with other farmers. The corporation was attempting to contain Thomas Parker's innovation until they could either acquire it or neutralize it. Sarah Lawson stepped forward again. "So they're trying to block official university research. What about unofficial farmer-to-farmer cooperation? Do their legal maneuvers cover that?" Dr. Chen considered this. "The injunction specifically targets university-sponsored research on Mason's property. It doesn't address independent farmers conducting their own agricultural experiments." A spark of inspiration lit Mason's eyes. "The university collected seed samples before the legal filing, didn't they?" "Yes," Dr. Chen confirmed. "We have samples of all 12 varieties in our lab, already catalogued and documented prior to Meridian's legal action." "And my grandfather's notebook details the soil preparation and planting methods," Mason continued, the plan forming as he spoke. "If each farmer prepared a small test plot according to those specifications, We could create a distributed research network, Dr. Chen finished, catching his vision immediately. Multiple independent trials across diverse conditions. Actually, from a scientific perspective, that would provide more robust data than a single test location, and it would bypass Meridian's legal obstruction, Blackwell added, since they've only blocked the university research on this specific property. Within hours, the impromptu gathering had transformed into an organized operation. Mason's kitchen table became a command center where Dr. Chen and her graduate students explained the science behind Thomas Parker's innovations to the assembled farmers. The soil amendment formula was analyzed for components that could be sourced locally, with substitutions calculated for ingredients that were harder to obtain. The beauty of your grandfather's approach, Dr. Chen explained as farmers took notes, is that it works with local soil biology rather than against it. You will need to adjust the basic formula slightly based on your specific soil conditions, but the principles remain the same. The university team had brought the precious seed samples, which were carefully divided into smaller quantities, enough for each farmer to establish a modest test plot of their own. The distribution was documented meticulously, with each farmer agreeing to maintain detailed records of growth patterns, water usage, and eventual yield. This isn't just about saving individual farms, Mason told the group as they prepared to depart with their seed allotments. It's about proving that there's an alternative to corporate agriculture, a way for independent farmers to adapt to changing climate conditions without surrendering control of their land or their future. The next morning, as dawn broke over Clearwater County, more than 20 small test plots were being prepared according to Thomas Parker's methods. Farmers who had been competitors now worked cooperatively, sharing equipment, labor, and expertise in a common cause. Mason's phone rang constantly with questions about soil preparation details or planting specifications. Dr. Chen coordinated the scientific aspects, creating standardized documentation forms and establishing a central database where all participants could report their results. What had begun as Mason's solitary gamble had evolved into a community-wide research initiative. Meanwhile, the original test plot on the North Field continued its remarkable development. The wheat now stood nearly 3 feet tall after just 10 days, with heads beginning to form. The corn had reached almost 6 feet, developing tassels at a pace that defied conventional growth timelines. Most impressively, all varieties maintained their vigor despite receiving less than a third of the water typically required. Word of the distributed experiment spread rapidly throughout the agricultural community. Farmers from neighboring counties began arriving to observe the original test field and learn about the project. Local news outlets picked up the story again, framing it as a grassroots research initiative, challenging corporate agricultural dominance. Meridian's response was swift and predictable. Catherine Donovan appeared at Mason's farm 2 days later, her usual professional composure noticeably strained. "This distributed planting scheme won't bypass our legal challenge," she informed Mason. "We're expanding our filing to include any plantings derived from the disputed seed technology." "These are farmers planting crops on their own land," Mason replied calmly, "a practice that predates your corporation by about 10,000 years. "This isn't a game, Mason," Catherine warned. "Meridian has the resources to pursue this litigation indefinitely. None of these farmers can afford the legal fees that are coming. Maybe not individually," Mason acknowledged, "but collectively with the university's support and public opinion behind us. That's a different equation." As Catherine departed, Mason knew the confrontation was far from over. Meridian wouldn't abandon its efforts to control or suppress his grandfather's innovation. The corporation had too much invested in maintaining the agricultural status quo. 1. that kept farmers dependent on their proprietary systems and products. With 15 days remaining until the bank's deadline, the distributed experiment produced its first results. Reports came in from farms across 3 counties as the experimental plots showed the same extraordinary germination and growth patterns Mason had observed in his north field. The evidence was becoming undeniable. Thomas Parker's seed varieties performed consistently across diverse conditions, maintaining their drought resistance and accelerated development regardless of location. Dr. Chen compiled the preliminary data into a comprehensive report, which the university submitted to agricultural journals, state officials, and media outlets. The report included economic projections showing that widespread adoption of these varieties could reduce irrigation requirements by over 60% while maintaining comparable yields, a potential game changer for drought-affected regions. Public interest in the story grew exponentially. The image of independent farmers uniting to test breakthrough crop varieties that could withstand drought conditions captured the imagination of a public increasingly concerned about climate change and food security. Local newspapers ran front-page features. Regional television stations produced special reports. Social media amplified the story further, with hashtags like Parker seeds and farming freedom trending in agricultural communities. As attention increased, political pressure mounted on Heartland Bank regarding its relationship with Meridian and the impending foreclosure of the Parker farm. State agricultural officials began asking pointed questions about how a potentially revolutionary, drought-resistant crop technology might be suppressed through financial maneuvering. The governor's office issued a statement expressing interest in the research and its potential impact on the state's agricultural economy. 3 days before the bank's deadline, William Travers arrived at the farm once more. The loan officer seemed uncomfortable as he surveyed the now thriving north field, where Mason and Dr. Chen were collecting mature wheat samples for analysis. "Mr. Parker, I've been authorized to offer an additional 90-day extension on your loan," Travers announced without preamble. "The bank's board has reconsidered your situation in light of recent developments." "You mean in light of public scrutiny and political pressure," Mason translated. Travers didn't dispute this. "The extension comes with a condition. The bank would like documentation of the commercial potential of these crop varieties, with a formal business plan for implementation." It wasn't forgiveness of his debt or a permanent solution, but it was time, precious time for the crops to complete their growth cycle and prove their value beyond any doubt. Mason agreed to the terms, recognizing the temporary reprieve for what it was, not a change of heart by the financial system, but a strategic retreat in the face of public opinion. As news of the extension spread, the coalition of farmers gathered once more at Mason's farm to celebrate the small victory and plan their next steps. The meeting had the atmosphere of a community festival, with families bringing food and children playing in the yard, while adults discussed crop development and resistance strategies against corporate pressure. Dr. Chen arrived with her team and a surprise guest, the university president, who announced the establishment of the Thomas Parker Center for Sustainable Agriculture. The center would focus on continuing his research and developing implementation strategies to help independent farmers adopt the drought-resistant varieties. "Your grandfather's work will be preserved and extended," the president assured Mason. "And most importantly, it will remain accessible to the farmers who need it most." As sunset painted the sky in brilliant hues of orange and purple, Mason stood at the edge of the north field with Blue faithfully at his side. The dog's muzzle had more gray than when this journey began, but his eyes remained alert as he surveyed the transformed landscape. Thomas Parker's impossible seeds now grown into a thriving demonstration of agricultural possibility. Mason reached down to run his hand through the wheat, feeling the heavy heads of grain that had developed in a fraction of the normal time with a fraction of the normal water. His grandfather's metal box, the container that had started everything, sat empty on his porch now, its precious contents distributed throughout the county in a network of experimental plots that would soon become the foundation of a new agricultural approach. The battle wasn't over. Meridian's legal challenges would continue. The bank's extension was temporary. The long-term implementation of his grandfather's innovations would face countless obstacles. But something fundamental had shifted, not just for Mason personally, but for the entire farming community. What had begun as one man's desperate gamble had evolved into a movement, a collective assertion that there were alternatives to the corporate agricultural model that had seemed inevitable just weeks ago. As Mason walked back toward the farmhouse, where farmers and researchers continued their animated discussions on his porch, he felt his grandfather's presence more strongly than at any time since the old man's passing. Thomas Parker had anticipated this moment, had prepared for it meticulously, developing not just drought-resistant seeds, but a pathway for their distribution that bypassed corporate control. The land endures when we honor its nature rather than force our will upon it, Mason quoted softly, remembering his grandfather's written words. The seeds were extraordinary in their design, but their true power lay in the community they had helped create. A network of independent farmers working cooperatively to preserve their way of life while adapting to environmental challenges. Mason. Parker had opened a mysterious metal box left by his grandfather and found not just seeds, but a vision, one that was now taking root across Clearwater County, transforming not just crops, but an entire community's understanding of what was possible when innovation served independence rather than corporate control. As the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, Mason knew with certainty that whatever challenges lay ahead, the legacy contained in that metal box would continue to grow, regenerating not just the soil, but the resilience and interdependence of the farming community itself, the most important crop his grandfather had cultivated over his long and visionary life. 1 year later, the sun rose over a transformed Clearwater County. Where once there had been dusty fields struggling against relentless drought, now stood vibrant crops flourishing, despite water restrictions that remained in effect throughout the region. The morning light caught on a new sign at the entrance. To the Parker Farm, Parker Seed Collective, growing tomorrow's solutions today. Mason Parker walked along the edge of the north field, the same plot where his grandfather's impossible seeds had first proven their worth. Today, it served as a demonstration garden, with each section showcasing a different drought-resistant variety. Labels identified the plants and provided data on water consumption, yield potential, and optimal growing conditions. A year had passed since those desperate days when foreclosure loomed, and Meridian Agricultural Enterprises seemed poised to absorb yet another family farm. So much had changed that Mason sometimes had to remind himself how close he'd come to selling his heritage to the corporation. Blue trotted beside him, grayer but still spry, the old dog's loyalty unwavering through all the transformations. Mason paused at a section of particularly robust wheat, the red-banded variety that had been his grandfather's cornerstone achievement. "Morning looks promising," called a familiar voice. Dr. Eleanor Chen approached from the direction of the newly constructed research center that now occupied what had once been fallow land at the eastern edge of the property. The Japanese agricultural delegation arrived at their hotel last night. They'll be here at 10 to see the collective in action. Mason nodded. International interest in Thomas Parker's seed varieties had grown steadily over the past year, with delegations from drought-affected regions around the world making pilgrimages to Clearwater County to witness the results firsthand. "The demonstration fields are ready," Mason assured her. Howard and Sarah are bringing in samples from their farms to show the adaptability across different soil conditions. Dr. Chen smiled. I still find it remarkable how quickly this has grown. From one desperate farmer with a metal box to an international agricultural movement in just a year. The Thomas Parker Center for Sustainable Agriculture had evolved beyond anyone's expectations. What began as a university research initiative had transformed into a comprehensive facility that combined scientific research, practical farmer training, and seed distribution programs. The center's main building, constructed with sustainable materials and powered entirely by renewable energy, housed laboratories, classrooms, and community meeting spaces. Mason's farmhouse remained his private residence, but the barn had been renovated into an agricultural museum, telling the story of Thomas Parker's decades-long work developing the drought-resistant varieties. The metal box that had contained the original seeds occupied a place of honor in the central display. Catherine Donovan called again yesterday, Dr. Chen mentioned as they walked toward the research center. Meridian's newest offer is quite creative, a proposed partnership rather than an acquisition. Mason shook his head. Same wolf, different sheep's clothing. They're still trying to gain control of the seed patents. After months of legal maneuvering, Meridian had ultimately failed to block the research or claim ownership of Thomas Parker's innovations. The distributed nature of the farmer experimentation had proven impossible to contain through legal means. When 20 separate farms simultaneously demonstrated the effectiveness of the seed varieties, each meticulously documenting their results according to Dr. Chen's protocols, the evidence became overwhelming. Public opinion had solidified behind the farmers' revolution, as local media dubbed it. State agricultural officials, recognizing the potential impact on regional food security, had intervened to facilitate a resolution that protected farmers' access to the technology. The university had secured the patents, but with a unique licensing structure that Mason had insisted upon, free use for small independent farmers, with commercial licensing fees for large agricultural corporations. Meridian, recognizing the inevitability of the seed's widespread adoption, had pivoted from opposition to attempted partnership, offering substantial investments in exchange for preferential access to future innovations. They still don't understand what this was really about, Mason remarked as they reached the research center. It was never just about drought-resistant crops. It was about changing the relationship between farmers and the land, and between farmers and corporations. Inside the center, preparations were underway for the day's visitors. Graduate students and research staff moved purposefully through the laboratories and preparation areas. Local farmers who had become part of the collective arrived with sample crops and soil analyses from their own fields. Howard Blackwell, who had emerged as a natural leader within the collective, was organizing the presentation materials at the central meeting table. Morning, Parker. Got the yield comparisons ready for the Japanese delegation. 3-year projections show their southwestern agricultural regions could increase production by 40%, while reducing water consumption by over half if they implement these varieties. The numbers were impressive, but they told only part of the story. The true revolution of Thomas Parker's seeds lay in their ability to regenerate soil health through the enhanced mycorrhizal relationships Dr. Chen had identified in those early days. Farms that had adopted the varieties were reporting not just drought resistance, but improved soil structure and water retention that benefited even conventional crops planted in rotation. Mason's phone buzzed with a message from Sarah Lawson. Water Commission meeting successful. New allocation model approved unanimously. Details when I arrive. This represented another victory in the ongoing transformation of regional agriculture. The Water Commission had been persuaded to implement a new allocation model that rewarded water conservation rather than historical usage rights. a change that benefited farms using the drought-resistant varieties while creating incentives for others to adopt similar practices. As the morning progressed, more members of the collective arrived. What had begun as a desperate alliance of struggling farmers had evolved into a structured cooperative that now included more than 60 farms across 5 counties. They shared equipment, expertise, and processing facilities while maintaining individual ownership of their land. The atmosphere was markedly different from the tension-filled days of the previous year. Farmers who had once faced foreclosure now discussed expansion plans and innovative implementations of Thomas Parker's technologies. The collective had established its own financing arm, a credit union specifically serving member farms, effectively bypassing traditional banks that had been aligned with corporate interests. Heartland Bank, recognizing the shifting financial landscape, had eventually offered Mason a comprehensive refinancing package with terms that acknowledged the increased value and productivity of his farm. Mason had declined, opting instead to work with the collective's credit union, a decision that reflected his commitment to the new agricultural ecosystem they were building. At precisely 10 o'clock, a convoy of vehicles arrived, carrying the Japanese delegation, agricultural officials, scientists, and farmers from regions facing severe water shortages. Mason, Dr. Chen, and representatives from the collective greeted them at the entrance to the demonstration fields. "Welcome to the Parker Seed Collective," Mason began, falling easily into the role of spokesperson that still felt somewhat unfamiliar. "What you'll see today represents not just new crop varieties, but a new approach to agriculture, one that works with natural systems rather than attempting to dominate them." As the tour proceeded through the demonstration plots, Mason found himself reflecting on the journey that had brought them to this point. The desperate farmer who had opened his grandfather's metal box just a year ago seemed like a different person, someone from another lifetime. The seeds had transformed not just the land, but Mason himself, awakening leadership abilities and community connections he hadn't known he possessed. The afternoon included a community lunch where collective members shared their experiences with the visiting delegation. Stories of farms saved, soil regenerated, and communities revitalized flowed around tables set up under shade trees near the research center. The gathering had the feeling of a harvest festival, a celebration of abundance that had seemed impossible during those drought-stricken days before Thomas Parker's seeds had changed everything. As the visitors departed with seed samples, research, data, and implementation plans, Mason noticed a familiar black SUV approaching along the main road. Catherine Donovan had apparently decided that a personal visit might accomplish what phone calls had not. Mason met her at the entrance to the property, where she emerged from her vehicle looking both impressed and slightly uncomfortable. "Quite a transformation," she observed, gesturing toward the thriving fields and bustling research center. "Meridian's board of directors has asked me to convey their congratulations on your success." "Thank you," Mason replied simply, waiting for the real purpose of her visit. "They've also authorized me to present a final offer," Catherine continued, handing him a folder. "Not for acquisition of your farm or the seed technology. We recognize that ship has sailed. Instead, we're proposing a strategic alliance. Meridian has distribution networks across 37 countries. We could help bring these seed varieties to drought-affected regions worldwide." Mason accepted the folder but didn't open it. "At what cost?" "Exclusive international distribution rights," Catherine answered, "and a seat on your collective's governing board." "Still trying to gain control," Mason observed, not unkindly. "Some things never change." "It's not about control, Mason. It's about scale and efficiency. What you've built here is remarkable, but reaching global markets requires infrastructure that only companies like Meridian can provide." Mason considered her words. There was some truth to them. The collective had discussed the challenges of expanding beyond regional implementation. International interest was growing faster than their ability to meet it. "I'll share your proposal with the collective's board," he said finally. "But I should tell you that we're already developing our own distribution cooperative with farmer organizations in 12 countries. It's slower than working with Meridian would be, but it preserves the principles that make this technology different." Catherine nodded, understanding the implicit rejection. "The offer stands if circumstances change. Meridian is nothing if not adaptable." As she drove away, Mason reflected on how much had changed in their relative positions. A year ago, Meridian had held all the power, financial pressure, legal leverage, and market dominance that had seemed insurmountable. Now they were the ones seeking access to what the collective had built. Later that evening, as sunset painted the sky in brilliant colors, the collective gathered for their monthly community dinner, a tradition that had evolved alongside their agricultural cooperation. Families spread picnic blankets on the grass near Mason's farmhouse. Children played between the tables of shared food, and conversations flowed as freely as the locally produced cider. Dr. Chen joined Mason on his porch, both of them taking a moment to observe the vibrant community that had formed around Thomas Parker's vision. "Your grandfather would be proud," she said, echoing words she had spoken a year earlier under very different circumstances. "Not just of the seed's success, but of how you've implemented his vision." "I was just the messenger," Mason demurred. "The seeds did the real work." "No," Dr. Chen shook her head firmly. "Seeds alone don't create community. You made choices that honored not just the science, but the spirit of your grandfather's work. You could have sold to Meridian at any point, taken the money and walked away. Many would have." Mason's gaze drifted to the small family cemetery where Thomas Parker rested alongside earlier generations of the family. Earlier that week, Mason had placed a small metal replica of the seed box on his grandfather's grave, a private acknowledgement of the legacy that had saved not just the Parker farm, but dozens of others. Sarah Lawson approached, holding a traditional harvest braid woven from the first cutting of the red-banded wheat. "For your wall," she said, handing it to Mason, "first harvest of the new tradition." The gesture moved Mason deeply. The harvest braid was an old farming custom, a symbol of gratitude for abundance and hope for continued prosperity. That Sarah had made one from his grandfather's wheat represented a perfect integration of innovation and tradition. As night fell, the gathering continued around campfires, with music from local musicians and stories shared about the year's challenges and triumphs. Mason moved among the groups, no longer the isolated farmer fighting a solitary battle, but part of something larger than himself. A community rebuilding its relationship with the land and with each other. Near one of the fires, Howard Blackwell was entertaining children with the now famous story of the mysterious metal box and the impossible seeds. "And when Mason Parker opened that box," he said dramatically, "he found more than just seeds. He found his grandfather's vision for a different kind of farming, one that works with nature instead of against it." The children listened, wide-eyed, as Blackwell described the seeds' miraculous growth and the community that had formed to protect them. The story had taken on elements of local legend, with Thomas Parker cast as a visionary who had seen the coming crisis and prepared a solution decades in advance. There was truth in that portrayal, Mason reflected. His grandfather had indeed anticipated both the environmental challenges and the corporate pressures that threatened independent farming. What no one could have predicted was how his solution would catalyze a community renaissance that went far beyond agriculture. As the evening wound down and families began to depart, Mason found himself alone on his porch once more, the empty metal box in his hands, a humble container that had held the seeds of transformation. Blue settled at his feet with a contented sigh as Mason looked out over the land his family had tended for generations. The fields were healthy now, the soil regenerating, the farm secure. But the true harvest had been the renewal of community bonds and the rekindling of agricultural independence that had seemed all but lost. Mason placed the metal box on the porch railing, where moonlight caught its surface. Empty now of seeds, it had served its purpose, delivering Thomas Parker's legacy exactly when it was needed most. But the container itself remained a powerful symbol of how innovation preserved through generations could emerge at the critical moment to change everything. The impossible seeds had lived up to their name, growing into something far greater than crops. They had grown into hope, independence, and a future where farming remained in the hands of those who worked the land. As Mason Parker finally turned toward his door, he carried with him the certainty that his grandfather's vision had not just been preserved, but fulfilled beyond anything the old man could have imagined. The metal box had been only the beginning. What grew from it would continue to flourish for generations to come. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.